Oh, sweet. This should be working, one would hope. Let's see. Oh, sweet. This should be working. It is! Tits. Nice. So, hello, loves. Or anybody who's watching currently. Miss Willow Knight here. I haven't been here in quite a few months. For no other reason than I've been a bit under the weather. But I'm feeling a bit better. Got the blood flowing, brain moving. And that means we can read. Nice, cozy time spent. Might be an hour shorter than the usual stream, but we're getting back to it. And I am potentially setting up some things attached to said streaming, but that comes later. For now, I'm gonna take a sip. The important bit is that I am back, and we're going to get back to our book. Though this may sound silly, and it probably will. I might switch books at some point. Not feeling this one. You never know. At least until I post a video about it or stream it. But, nonetheless, back to Cabinet of Curiosities. Where we left off some almost 5 odd months ago, it feels. We were reading a letter written by a very panicked man who was afraid of his tenant. We left off right as that letter did. Two seconds. And I will turn myself up. Oh, no, I am up. Quite nicely, honestly. Live chat. There we go. Chapter 6. Roger Brisbane leaned back in his office chair, his eyes roaming the glass expanse of desk that lay before him. It was a long, enjoyable perambulation. Brisbane liked order, purity, simplicity, and the desk shone with a mirror-like perfection. At last, his gaze came to the case of jewels. 2 seconds. We're back. Where were we? There it is. It was that time of day when a lance of sunlight shot through the case, turning its occupants into glittering spheres and ovals of entangled light and color. One could call an emerald green, or a sapphire blue, but the words did no justice to the actual colors. There were no adequate words for such colors in any human language. Jewels. They lasted forever. So hard and cold and pure. So impervious to decay. Always beautiful. Always perfect. Always as fresh as the day they were born in unimaginable heat and pressure. So unlike human beings, with their opaque, rubbery flesh and their odoriferous descent from birth to the grave. Odoriferous is the word I was trying to do. Also, gonna pause here because I hear dogs. Back to it. Or so I thought. What's a girl gotta do to get a little quiet? This back. And we're back. For how long, who knows? Life is a bit of chaos, but the chaos is fun. This back. And Okay, so I'll start from the last period. So unlike human beings, with their opaque, rubbery flesh and their odoriferous descent from birth to the grave. Odoriferous. Yeah, there'll be a stumbler or two. I'm a little rusty. A story of drool, semen, and tears. He should have become a gemologist. He would have been much happier surrounded by those blooms of pure light. The law career his father had chosen for him was nothing more than a vile parade of human failure. And his job in the museum brought him in contact with that failure, day in and day out, in stark illumination. He turned to lean over a computer printout with a sigh. It was now clear the museum should never have borrowed 100 million for its new state-of-the-art planetarium. More cuts were needed. Heads would have to roll. Well, at least that shouldn't be too hard to accomplish. The museum was full of useless, tweedy, overpaid curators and functionaries, always whining about budget cuts, never answering their phones, always off on some research trip spending the museum's money or writing books that nobody ever read. Cushy jobs. Sinecures. Unable to be fired because of tenure. Unless exceptional circumstances existed. He put the printout through a nearby shredder, then opened a drawer and pulled out several tied packets of inter-office correspondence. The mail of a dozen likely candidates, intercepted thanks to a man in the mailroom who had been caught organizing a Super Bowl pool on museum time. With any luck, he'd find plenty of exceptional circumstances inside. It was easier, and easier to justify, than scanning email. Brisbane shuffled the packets with interest. Then he stopped, glancing at one of them. Here was a case in point. This man, Puck. He sat in the archives all day long. Doing what? Nothing, except causing trouble for the museum. He untied the packet, rifled through the envelopes within. On the front and back of each were dozens of lines for addresses. The envelopes had a little red tie string and could be reused until they fell apart, simply by adding a new name to the next blank line. And there, on the second-to-last line, was Puck's name. And following it was Nora's name. Brisbane's hand tightened around the envelope. What was it that arrogant FBI agent Pendergast had said? Most of the work will be archival in nature. He unwound the string and slid out a single piece of paper. A whiff of dust rose from the envelope, and Brisbane hastily raised a protective tissue to his nose. Holding the paper at arm's length, he read, "Dear Dr. Kelly, I found another small box of papers in Shodham's cabinet, which somehow had been recently misplaced. Not nearly as astonishing as what you have already uncovered, yet interesting in its own way. I will leave it for you in the archives reading room. P." Color crept into Brisbane's face, then drained out again. It was just as he thought. She was still working for that arrogant FBI agent, and she was continuing to enlist Puck's help. This thing had to be stopped, and Puck had to go. Just look at this note, Brisbane thought, manually typed on what was clearly an ancient typewriter. The very inefficiency of it made Brisbane's blood boil. The museum was not a welfare program for eccentrics. Puck was a fossilized anachronism who should have been put out to pasture long before. He would gather suitable evidence, then draw up a recommended termination list for the next executive committee meeting. Puck's name would be at the top. But what about Nora? He remembered the words of the museum director, Colopy, at the recent meeting. "Document, document," the director had murmured. And softly it would be. For now. Chapter 7. Smithback stood on the sidewalk, midway between Columbus and Amsterdam, gazing speculatively up at the red brick facade before him. 108 West 99th Street was a broad, pre-war apartment house. Unembarrassed by any distinguishing architecture, bright in the noonday sun. The bland exterior didn't bother him. What mattered lay within. A rent-stabilized two-bedroom apartment near the museum for only $1,800 a month. He stepped back toward the street, giving the neighborhood a once-over. It wasn't the most charming Upper West Side neighborhood he had seen, but it had possibilities. Two bums sat on a nearby stoop, drinking something out of a paper bag. He glanced at his watch. Nora would be arriving in 5 minutes. Christ, this was going to be an uphill battle anyway. If only those bums would take a walk around the corner. He fished into his pocket, found a $5 bill, and sauntered over. "Nice day if it don't rain," he said. The bums eyed him suspiciously. Smithback brandished the $5. "Hey, guys, go buy yourself some lunch, okay?" One of them grinned, exposing a row of decaying teeth. "For $5, mister? Man, you can't buy a cup of Starbucks for $5. And my legs hurt." "Yeah," said the other, wiping his nose. Smithback pulled out a 20. "Oh, my aching legs. Take it or leave it." The closest bum took the 20, and the pair rose to their feet with histrionic groans and sniffles. Soon they were shuffling toward the corner, heading no doubt to the nearby liquor store on Broadway. Smithback watched their retreating backs. At least they were harmless rummies, and not crackheads, or worse. He glanced around and saw, right on schedule, a blade-thin woman in black come clicking down the block, a bright, fake lipstick smile on her face. The real estate broker. "You must be Mr. Smithback," she said in a smoker's croak as he took his hand. Living around them, I can imitate that. "I'm Millie Locke. I have the key to the apartment. Is your partner here?" There she is now. Nora had just rounded the corner, cotton trench coat billowing, knapsack thrown over her shoulder. She waved. When Nora arrived, the agent took her hand, saying, "How lovely." They entered a dingy lobby, lined on the left with mailboxes and on the right with a large mirror, a feeble attempt to make the narrow hallway look bigger than it actually was. They pressed the button for the elevator. There was a whir and a rattle somewhere overhead. "It's a perfect location," said Smithback to Nora. 20-minute walk to the museum, close to the subway station. A block and a half from the park. Dang it. There it is. Nora did not respond. She was staring at the elevator door, and she did not look happy. The elevator creaked open, and they stepped in. Smithback waited out the excruciatingly long ride, silently willing the damn elevator to hurry up. He had the unpleasant feeling that he, not just the apartment, was undergoing an inspection. At last, they got out of the 6th floor, took a right in a dim hallway, and stopped in front of a brown metal door with an eye hole set into it. The real estate broker unlocked 4 separate locks and swung the door open. Smithback was pleasantly surprised. The apartment faced the street, and it was cleaner than he expected. The floors were oak, a bit warped, but oak nevertheless. One wall was exposed brick, the others painted sheetrock. "Hey, what do you think?" he said brightly. "Pretty nice, huh?" Nora said nothing. "It's the bargain of the century," said the broker. $1,800. Rent stabilized, AC, great location. Bright, quiet. The kitchen had old appliances, but was clean. The bedrooms were sunny with south-facing windows, which gave the little rooms a feeling of space. They stopped in the middle of the living room. "Well, Nora?" Smithback asked, feeling uncharacteristically shy. "What do you think?" Nora's face was dark, her brow furrowed. This did not look good. The real estate broker withdrew a few feet to give them the pretense of privacy. "It's nice," she said. "Nice? $1,800 a month for an Upper West Side 2-bedroom in a pre-war building. It's awesome." The real estate broker leaned back toward them. "You're the first to see it. I guarantee it'll be gone before sunset." She fumbled in her purse, removed a cigarette and a lighter, flicked on the lighter, and then, with both hands poised inches apart, asked, "May I?" "Are you all right?" Smithback asked Nora. Nora waved her hand, took a step toward the window. She appeared to be looking intently at something far away. "You did talk to the landlord about moving out, didn't you?" "No, not quite yet." Smithback felt his heart sink a little. "You haven't told him?" She shook her head. The sinking feeling grew more pronounced. "Come on, Nora. I thought we decided on this." She looked out a window. "This is a big move for me, Bill. I mean, living together." Her voice trailed off. Smithback glanced around at the apartment. The real estate broker caught his eye, quickly looked away. He lowered his voice. "Nora, you do love me, right?" She continued, looking out the window. "Of course, but this is just a really bad day for me, okay? It's no big deal. It's not like we're engaged. Let's not talk about it." "Not talk about it?" "Nora, this is the apartment. We're never going to find a better one. Let's settle the broker's fee." "Broker's fee?" Smithback turned to the agent. "What did you say your fee was for this place?" The agent exhaled a cloud of smoke, gave a little cough. "I'm glad you asked. It's quite reasonable. Of course, you can't just rent an apartment like this. I'm doing you a special favor just showing it to you." "So, how much is this fee?" Nora asked. 18. 18 what? Dollars? Percent. Of the first year's rent, that is. "But that's..." Nora frowned, did the calculations in her head. "That's close to $4,000. "It's cheap, considering what you're getting. And I promise you, if you don't go for it, the next person will." She glanced at her watch. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. That's how much time you have to make your decision." "What about it, Nora?" Smithback asked. Nora sighed. "I have to think about this." "We don't have time to think about it." "We have all the time in the world. This isn't the only apartment in Manhattan." There was a brief, frozen silence. The real estate broker glanced again at her watch. Nora shook her head. "Bill, I told you. It's been a bad day." "I can see that." "You know the Shodom collection I told you about? Yesterday we found a letter. A terrible letter hidden among that collection." Smithback felt a feeling akin to panic creeping over him. "Can we talk about this later? I really think this is the apartment..." She rounded on him, her face dark. "Didn't you hear what I said? We found a letter. We know who murdered those 36 people." There was another silence. Smithback glanced over at the real estate broker, who was pretending to examine a window frame. Her ears were practically twitching. "You do?" he asked. "He's an extremely shadowy figure named Enoch Lang. He seems to have been a taxonomist and a chemist. The letter was written by a man named Shodom, who owned a kind of museum on the site, called Shodom's Cabinet. Lang rented rooms from Shodom and performed experiments in them. Shodom grew suspicious, took a look into Lang's lab when he was away. He discovered that Lang had been kidnapping people, killing them, and then dissecting out part of their central nervous system and processing it. Apparently, for self-administered injections." "Good God. What for?" Nora shook her head. "You're not going to believe this. He was trying to extend his lifespan." "That's incredible." This was a story. A gigantic story. Smithback glanced over at the real estate broker. She was now intently examining the door jambs, her next appointment seemingly forgotten. "That's what I thought." Nora shuddered. "God, I just can't get that letter out of my head. All the details were there. And Pendergast. You should have seen how grim his face was while he was reading it, looking as if he was reading his own obituary or something. And then this morning, when I went down to check on some more Shoda material that had turned up, I learned that orders had come down from some conservation work in the archives. All the Shodan papers were included. And now, they're gone. You can't tell me that's coincidence. It was either Brisbane or Colopy. I'm sure of that. But, of course, I can't come right out and ask them." "Did you get a photocopy?" The dark look on Nora's face lifted slightly. "Pendergast asked me to make one after we first read the letter. I didn't understand his hurry then. I do now. Do you have it?" She nodded toward the briefcase. Smithback thought for a moment. Nora was right. The conservation orders, of course, were no coincidence. What was the museum covering up? Who was this man Enoch Lang? Was he connected to the early museum in some way? Or was it just the usual museum paranoia, afraid to let any information that wasn't buffed and polished by their PR people? Then, of course, there was Fairhaven, the developer who also happened to be a big contributor to the museum. This whole story was getting good. Very good. "Can I see the letter?" "I was going to give it to you for safekeeping. I don't dare bring it back into the museum. But I want it back tonight." Smithback nodded. She handed him a thick envelope, which he shoved into his briefcase. There was a sudden buzz of the intercom. "That's my next appointment," said the broker. "Should I tell them you're taking it, or what?" "We're not," said Nora decisively. She shrugged, went to the intercom, and buzzed them in. "Nora," Smithback implored. He turned to the real estate agent. "We are taking it." "I'm sorry, Bill, but I'm just not ready." "But last week you said—" "I know what I said, but I can't think about apartments at a time like this. Okay?" "No, it's not okay." The doorbell rang, and the broker moved to open the door. 2 men came in, one bald and short, one tall and bearded. Gave the living room a quick look, swept through the kitchen and into the bedrooms. "Nora, please," Smithback said. "Look, I know this move to New York, the job at the museum, hasn't been as smooth as you hoped. I'm sorry about that. But that doesn't mean you should—" There was a lengthy interval while the shower was being turned on, then off, and then the couple were back in the living room. The inspection had taken less than 2 minutes. "It's perfect," said the bald one. 18% broker's fee, right?" "Right." "Great." A checkbook appeared. Who do I make it out to? Cash. We'll take it to your bank. No, wait just a minute, Smithback said. We were here first. I'm so sorry, said one of the men politely, turning in surprise. Don't mind them, said the broker harshly. Those people are on their way out. Come on, Bill. Nora began urging him to the door. We were here first. I'll take it myself if I have to. There was a snap as the man detached the check. The broker reached for it. I've got the lease right here, she said, patting her bag. We can sign it at the bank. Nora dragged Smithback out the front door and slammed it shut. The ride downstairs was silent and tense. A moment later, they were standing on the street. I've got to get back to work, Nora said, looking away. We can talk about this tonight. We certainly will. Smithback watched her stride down 99th Street in the slanting light, the trench coat curling away from her perfect little behind, her long copper hair swinging back and forth. He felt stricken. After all they had been through, she still didn't want to live with him. What had he done wrong? Sometimes he wondered if she blamed him for pressuring her to move east from Santa Fe. It wasn't his fault the job at the Lloyd Museum had fallen through, and her boss here in Manhattan was a prize asshole. How could he change his mind? Change her mind. How could he change her mind? How could he prove to her that he really loved her? An idea began to form in his mind. Nora didn't really appreciate the power of the press, particularly the New York Times. She didn't realize just how cowed, how docile and cooperative the museum could be when faced with bad publicity. Yes, he thought, this would work. She would get the publicity. She would get the collections back, and get her carbon-14 dating funded, and more. She would thank him in the end. If he worked fast, he could even make the early edition. Smithback heard a hearty yell. Hey, friend! He turned. There were the two bums, fiery-faced now, holding on to each other, staggering up the sidewalk. One of them lifted a paper bag. Have a drink, on us! Smithback took another 20 and held it up in front of the bigger and dirtier of the two. Tell you what, in a few minutes, you'll see a thin lady dressed in black come out of this building with two guys. Her name's Millie. Give her a really big hug and a kiss for me, will ya? The sloppier, the better. You bet! The man snatched the bill and stuffed it into his pocket. Smithback went down the street toward Broadway, feeling marginally better. Gonna take a sip. Chapter 8. Anthony Fairhaven settled his lean, muscular frame into the chair, spread a heavy linen napkin across his lap, and examined the breakfast that lay before him. It was minuscule, yet arrayed with excessive care on the crisp white damask. A china glass of tea, 2 water biscuits, royal jelly. He drained the tea in a single toss, nibbled absently at the cracker, then wiped his lips and signaled the maid for his paper with a curt motion. The sun streamed in through the curved glass wall of his breakfast atrium. From his vantage point atop the Metropolitan Tower, all of Manhattan lay prostrate at his feet, glittering in the dawn light, windows winking pink and gold. His own personal new world, waiting for him to claim his manifest destiny. Far below, the dark rectangle of Central Park lay like a gravedigger's hole in the midst of the great city. The light was just clipping the tops of the trees, the shadows of the buildings along Fifth Avenue lying across the park like bars. There was a rustle, and his maid laid the two papers before him, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, freshly ironed, as he insisted. He picked up the Times and unfolded it, the warm scent of newsprint reaching his nostrils, the sheet crisp and dry. He gave the paper a little shake to loosen it, and turned to the front page. He scanned the headlines. Middle East peace talks, mayoral election debates, earthquake in Indonesia. He glanced below the fold. Momentarily, he stopped breathing. Newly discovered letter sheds light on 19th century killings by William Smithback, Jr. He blinked his eyes, took a long, deep breath, and began to read. New York, October 8th. A letter has been found in the archives of the New York Museum of Natural History that may help explain the grisly charnel discovered in Lower Manhattan earlier last week. In that discovery, workmen constructing a residential tower at the corner of Henry and Catherine Streets unearthed a basement tunnel containing the remains of 36 young men and women. The remains had been walled up in a dozen alcoves in what was apparently an old coal tunnel, dating from the middle of the 19th century. Preliminary forensic analysis showed that the victims had been dissected, or perhaps autopsied, and subsequently dismembered. Preliminary dating of the site by an archaeologist, Nora Kelly, of the New York Museum of Natural History, indicated that the killings had occurred between 1872 and 1881, when the coroner was occupied by a three-story building housing a private museum known as J.C. Shodham's Cabinet of Natural Productions and Curiosities. The cabinet burned in 1881, and Shodham died in the fire. In subsequent research, Dr. Kelly discovered the letter, which was written by J.C. Shodham himself, written shortly before Shodham's death. It describes his uncovering of the medical experiments of his lodger, a taxonomist and chemist by the name of Enoch Lang. In the letter, Shodham alleged that Lang was conducting surgical experiments on human subjects in an attempt to prolong his own life. The experiments appeared to have involved the surgical removal of the lower portion of the spinal cord from a living subject. Shodham appended to his letter several passages from Lang's own detailed journal of his experiments. A copy of the letter was obtained by the New York Times. If the remains are indeed from murdered individuals, it would be the largest serial killing in the history of New York City, and perhaps the largest in U.S. history. Jack the Ripper, England's most famous serial killer, murdered 7 women in the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. Jeffrey Dahmer, America's notorious serial killer, is known to have killed at least 17 people. The human remains were removed to the medical examiner's office and have been unavailable for examination. The basement tunnel was subsequently destroyed by Mogan Fairhaven, Inc., the developer of the tower, during normal construction activities. According to Mary Hill, a spokesperson for Mayor Edward Montefiore, the site did not fall under the New York Archaeological and Historic Preservation Act. "This is an old crime scene of little archaeological interest," Miss Hill said. "It simply did not meet the criteria spelled out in the Act. We had no basis to stop construction." Representatives of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, however, have taken a different view, and are reportedly asking a state senator and the New York Investigator's Office to assemble a task force to look into the matter. One article of clothing was preserved from the site, a dress, which was brought to the museum for examination by Dr. Kelly. Sewn into the dress, Dr. Kelly found a piece of paper, possibly a note of self-identification, written by a young woman who apparently believed she had only a short time to live. "I am Mary Green, aged 19 years, number 16 Water Street." Tests indicated the note had been written in human blood. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has taken an interest in the case. Special Agent Pendergast, from the New Orleans office, has been observed on the scene. Neither the New York nor the New Orleans FBI offices would comment. The exact nature of his involvement has not been made public, but Pendergast is known as one of the highest-ranking special agents in the southern region. He has worked on several high-profile cases in New York before. The New York City Police Department, meanwhile, has shown little interest in a crime that occurred more than a century ago. Captain Sherwood Custer, in whose precinct the remains were found, says the case is primarily of historical interest. The murderer is dead, and the accomplices must be dead. We'll leave this one to the historians and continue to devote our resources to crime prevention in the 21st century. Following the discovery of the letter, the New York Museum removed the Shodom cabinet collection from the museum archives. Roger Brisbane, first vice president of the museum, called the move part of a long-scheduled, ongoing conservation process, a coincidence that has nothing to do with these reports. He referred all further questions to Harry Medeker in the museum's public relations department. Mr. Medeker did not return several telephone calls from the Times. The story continued on an inside page, where the reporter described the details of the old murders with considerable relish. Fairhaven read the article to the end, then turned back and read the first page once again. The dry leaves of the Times made a faint rustling sound in his hands, echoed by the trembling of the dead leaves clinging to the potted trees on the balcony outside the atrium. Fairhaven slowly laid down the paper and looked out once more again over the city. He could see the New York Museum across the park, its granite towers and copper roofs catching the newly minted light. It's not once more again, it's once again. He flicked his fingers, and another cup of tea arrived. He stared at the cup without pleasure, tossed it down. Another flick of his fingers brought him a phone. Fairhaven knew a great deal about real estate development, public relations, and New York politics. He knew this article was a potential disaster. It called for firm, prompt action. He paused, thinking who should receive the first telephone call. A moment later, he dialed the mayor's private number, which he knew by heart. Another sip. Chapter 9. Doreen Hollander of 21 Indian Feather Lane, Pine Creek, Oklahoma, had left her husband 26 stories overhead, mumbling and snoring in their hotel room. Gazing across the broad expanse of Central Park West, she decided now was the perfect time to view Monet's water lilies at the Metropolitan Museum. She'd wanted to get a glimpse of the famous paintings ever since seeing a poster at her sister-in-law's house. Her husband, service technician for Oklahoma Cable, hadn't the faintest interest in art. Chances were he'd still be asleep when she returned. Consulting the visitor's map the hotel had so generously volunteered, she was pleased to discover the museum lay just across Central Park. A short walk, no need to call for an expensive taxi. Doreen Hollander liked walking, and this would be the perfect way to burn off those croissants with butter and marmalade she had unwisely eaten for breakfast. She started off, crossing into the park at the Alexander Humboldt Gate, walking briskly. It was a beautiful fall day, and the big buildings of Fifth Avenue shone above the treetops. New York City. A wonderful place, as long as you didn't have to live here. The path dropped down, and soon she came to the side of a lovely pond. She gazed across. Would it be better to go around? Around it, to the right, or to the left? She consulted her map and decided the left-hand way would be shorter. She set off again, on her strong farm-girl legs, inhaling the air. Surprisingly fresh, she thought. Bicyclists and rollerbladers whizzed past as the road curved alongside the pond. Soon, she found herself at another fork. The main path swerved northward, but there was a footpath that continued straight, in the direction she was going, through a wood. She consulted her map. It didn't show the footpath, but she knew a better route when she saw it. She continued on. Quickly, the path branched, then branched again, wandering aimlessly up and down through hillocks and little rocky outcrops. Here and there through the trees she could still make out the row of skyscrapers along Fifth Avenue, beckoning her on, showing her the way. The woods grew more dense, and then she began to see the people. It was odd. Here and there, young men stood idly, hands in pockets, in the woods, waiting. But waiting for what? They were nice-looking young men, well-dressed with good haircuts. Out beyond the trees, a bright fall morning was in progress, and she didn't feel the slightest bit afraid. She hurried on as the woods grew thicker. She stopped to consult her map, a little puzzled, and discovered she was in a place called the Ramble. It was a well-chosen name, she decided. Twice she had found herself turned completely around. It was as if the person who had designed this little maze of paths wanted people to get lost. Well, Doreen Hollander was not one to get lost. Not in a tiny patch of woods in a city park. When, after all, she had grown up in the country, roaming the fields and woods of eastern Oklahoma. This walk was turning into a little adventure, and Doreen Hollander liked little adventures. That was why she had dragged her husband to New York City to begin with, to have a little adventure. Doreen forced herself to smile. If this didn't beat all, now she was turned around yet again. No, I didn't read the right. If this didn't beat all, now she was turned around yet again. With a rueful laugh, she consulted her map. But on the map, the Ramble was marked simply as a large mass of leafy green. She looked around. Perhaps one of the nice-looking men could help her with directions. But here, the woods were darker, thicker. Nevertheless, through a screen of leaves, she saw two figures. She approached. What were they doing in there? She took another step forward, pulled a branch aside, and peered through. The peer turned into a stare, and the stare turned into a mask of frozen horror. Then, abruptly, she backed away, turned, and began retracing her steps as quickly as she could. Now it was all clear. How perfectly disgusting. Her only thought was to get out of this terrible place as quickly as possible. All desire to see Monet's water lilies had flown from her head. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but it was all true. It was just as she'd heard tell in the 700 Club on television. New York City as a modern Sodom and Gomorrah. She hurried along, her breath coming in short gasps, and she looked back only once. When the swift footsteps came up behind her, she heard nothing and expected nothing. When the black hood came down hard and tight over her head, and the sudden wet stench of chloroform violated her nostrils, the last vision in her mind was of a twisted spire of salt glittering in the desolate light of an empty plain. A plume of bitter smoke rising in the distance. Chapter 8. No, not 8. 10. My brain's going back in time. The eminent Dr. Frederick Watson Colopy sat in state behind the great 19th century leather-bound desk, reflecting on the men and women who had preceded him in this august position. In the museum's glory years, the years, say, when this vast desk was still new, the directors of the museum had been true visionaries, explorers and scientists both. He lingered appreciatively over their names. Bird, Throckmorton, Andrews. Now, those are names worthy to be cast in bronze. His appreciation waned somewhat as he approached the more recent occupants of his grand corner office. The unfortunate Winston Wright and his short-tenured successor, Olivia Merriam. He felt no little satisfaction in returning the office to its former state of dignity and accomplishment. He ran a hand along his well-trimmed beard, laid a finger across his lip in thoughtful meditation. And yet, here it was again, that persistent feeling of melancholy. He had been called upon to make certain sacrifices in order to rescue the museum. It distressed him that scientific research was forced to take second place to galas, to glittering new halls, to blockbuster exhibitions. Blockbuster. The word tasted repellent in the mouth. And yet, this was New York at the dawn of the 21st century, and those who did not play the game would not survive. Even his grandest forebears had their own crosses to bear, one bent with the winds of time. The museum had survived. That was the important. That was the only point. He then reflected on his own distinguished scientific lineage. His great-grand-uncle Amasa Greenough, friend to Darwin and famed discoverer of the chitinous monkfish of the Indochine. His great-aunt Philomena Watson, who had done seminal work with the natives of Terra del Fuego. His grandfather, Gardner Colopy, the distinguished herpetologist. He thought of his own exciting work reclassifying the Pongidea during the heady days of his youth. Perhaps, with luck and a goodly allowance of years, his tenure here at the museum would rival the great directors of his past. Perhaps he, too, would have his name graven in bronze, enshrined in the great rotunda for all to see. He still couldn't shake the feeling of melancholy that had settled around him. These reflections, normally so soothing, seemed not to help. He felt a man out of place, old-fashioned, superannuated. Even thoughts of his lovely young wife, with whom he had sported so delightfully that very morning before breakfast, failed to shake his feelings. The feeling. His eye took in the office, the pink marble fireplaces, the round tower windows looking out over Museum Drive, the oak paneling with its patina of centuries, the paintings by Audubon and de Clefis. He regarded his own person, the somber suit with its old-fashioned, almost clerical cut, the starched white shirt-front, the silk bow-tie worn as a sign of independence, in thought and deed, the handmade shoes, and above all, as his eye fell on the mirror above the mantel, the handsome and even elegant face, if a touch severe, that wore its burden of years so gracefully. He turned to his desk with a faint sigh. Perhaps it was the news of the day that made him gloomy. It sat on his desk, spread out in glaring newsprint, the damnable article, written by that same vile fellow who had caused so much trouble at the museum back in '95. He had hoped the earlier removal of the offending materials from the archives would have quieted things down. But now there was this letter to deal with. On every level, this had the potential to be a disaster. His own staff drawn in, an FBI agent running around, Fairhaven, one of their biggest supporters, under fire. Colopy's head reeled at the possibilities, all too hideous to contemplate. If this thing wasn't handled, it could very well cast a pall on his own tenure, or worse. Do not go to that place, thought Frederick Watson Colopy. He would handle it. Even the worst disaster could be turned around with the right. What was that trendy word? Spin. Yes, that's what he needed here. A very delicate and artfully applied spin. The museum would not, he thought, react in its usual knee-jerk way. The museum would not decry the investigation. It would not protest the rifling of its archives. It would not denounce the unaccountable activities of this FBI agent. It would not deny responsibility, evade, or cover up. Nor would the museum come to the aid of its biggest supporter, Fairhaven. At least, not on the surface. And yet, much would be done in camera, so to speak. A quiet word could be strategically placed here and there, reassurances given or taken away, money moved hither and yon, gently, very gently. He depressed a button on his intercom and spoke in a mild voice. "Miss Surd, would you be so good as to tell Mr. Brisbane I should like to see him at his convenience?" "Yes, Dr. Colopy." "Thank you kindly, Miss Surd." "Mrs. Surd." He released the button and settled back. Then he carefully folded up the New York Times and placed it out of sight, in the to-be-filed box at the corner of his desk. And, for the first time since leaving his bedroom that morning, he smiled. Chapter 11. Nora Kelly knew what the call was about. She'd seen the article in the morning paper, of course. It was the talk of the museum, perhaps of all New York. She knew what kind of effect it would have on a man like Brisbane. She had been waiting all day for him to call her, and now, at 10 minutes to 5, the summons had finally come. He had waited until 10 minutes to 5, letting her stew, no doubt. She wondered if that meant he would give her 10 minutes to clear out of the museum. It wouldn't surprise her. The nameplate was missing from Brisbane's door. She knocked, and the secretary called her in. "Have a seat, please," said a haggard old woman who was clearly in a bad mood. Nora sat. "God damned, Bill," she thought. What could he have been thinking? Admittedly, the guy was impulsive. He tended to act before engaging his cerebral cortex. But this was too much. She'd have his guts for garters, as her father used to say. She'd cut off his balls, fix them to a thong, and wear them around her waist like a bola. This job was so critical to her. Yet, here he was, practically typing out the pink slip himself. How could he have done this to her? The secretary's phone buzzed. "You may go in," the old woman said. Nora entered the inner office. Let me check something. the older woman said. Nora entered the inner office. Brisbane stood in front of a mirror placed at one side of his desk, tying a bow tie around his neck. He wore black pants with a satin stripe and a starched shirt with mother-of-pearl buttons. A tuxedo jacket was draped over his chair. Nora paused inside the door, waiting, but Brisbane said nothing, nor in any way acknowledged her presence. She watched him deftly, whip one end of the tie over the other, snug the end through. Then he spoke. "Over the past few hours, I've learned a great deal about you, Dr. Kelly." Nora remained silent. "About a disastrous field expedition in the southwestern desert, for example, in which your leadership and even scientific abilities were called into question. And about a certain William Smithback. I didn't know you were quite so friendly with this William Smithback of the Times." There was another pause while he tugged on the ends of the tie. As he worked, he craned his neck. It rose out of his collar, as pale and scrawny as a chicken's. "I understand, Dr. Kelly, that you brought non-museum personnel into the archives, in direct violation of the rules of this museum." He tightened and adjusted. Nora said nothing. "Furthermore, you've been doing outside work on museum time, assisting this FBI agent. Again, a clear violation of the rules." Nora knew it would be futile to remind Brisbane that he himself, however grudgingly, had authorized the work. Finally, it's a violation of museum rules to have contact with the press without clearing it through our public relations office first. There are good reasons for all these rules, Dr. Kelly. These are not mere bureaucratic regulations. They relate to the museum's security, to the integrity of its collection and archives, and especially its reputation. Do you understand me? Nora looked at Brisbane, but could find no words. Your conduct has caused a great deal of anxiety here. Look, she said, if you're going to fire me, get it over with. Brisbane looked at her at last, his pink face forming an expression of mock surprise. Who said anything about firing? Not only will we not fire you, but you are forbidden to resign. Nora looked at him in surprise. Dr. Kelly, you will remain with the museum. After all, you're the hero of the hour. Dr. Colopy and I are united on this. We wouldn't dream of letting you go. Not after that self-serving, self-aggrandizing newspaper piece. You're bulletproof. For now. Nora listened, her surprise slowly turning to anger. Brisbane patted the bow tie, examined himself one last time in the mirror, and turned. All your privileges are suspended. No access to the central collections or the archives. Am I allowed to use the girls' room? No contact with anyone on the outside involving museum business, and especially no contact with that FBI agent or that journalist, Smithback. No need to worry about Smithback, Nora thought, furious now. We know all about Smithback. There's a file on him downstairs that's a foot thick. As you probably know, he wrote a book about the museum a few years back. That was before my time, and I haven't read it. But I've heard it wasn't exactly Nobel Prize material. He's been persona non grata around here ever since. He looked at her directly, his eyes cold and unwavering. In the meantime, it's business as usual. Going to the new Primate Hall opening tonight? I wasn't planning to. Start planning. After all, you're our employee of the week. People are going to want to see you up and about, looking chipper. In fact, the museum will be issuing a press release about our own heroic Dr. Kelly, pointing out in the process how civic-minded the museum is, how we have a long history of doing pro bono work for the city. Of course, you will deflect any further questions about this business by saying that all your work is completely confidential. Brisbane lifted the jacket from the chair and daintily shrugged himself into it, flicking a stray thread from his shoulders, touching his perfect hair. I'm sure you can find a halfway decent dress among your things. Just be glad it isn't one of the fancy dress balls the museum's so fond of these days. What if I say no? What if I don't get with your little program? Brisbane shot his cuffs and turned to her again. Then his eyes flicked to the door, and Nora's gaze followed. Standing in the doorway, hands folded before him, was Dr. Colopy himself. The director cut a fearsome, almost sinister figure as he silently walked the halls of the museum, his thin frame dressed in formal severity, his profile that of an Anglican deacons. Anglican. That's a word I haven't thought about in a while. Anglican deacons. His posture rigid and forbidding? God, I need to practice. Colopy, who came from a long background of gentlemen, scientists, and inventors, had an enigmatic demeanor and a quiet voice that never seemed to be raised. To top it off, the man owned a brownstone on West End Avenue. The second one would be impossible. In which he lived with a gorgeous new wife, 40 years his junior. The relationship was the subject of endless comment and obscene speculation. But today, Director Colopy was almost smiling. He took a step forward. The angular lines of his pale face looked much softer than usual, even animated. He actually took her hand between his own dry palms, eyes looking closely into hers, and Nora felt a faint and wholly unexpected tingle. She abruptly saw what that young wife must have also seen. A very vital man was hidden behind that normally impenetrable facade. Now, Colopy did smile, and when he did so, it was as if a heat lamp had switched on. Nora felt bathed in a radiance of charm and vigor. "I know your work, Nora, and I've been following it with tremendous interest. To think that the great ruins of Chaco Canyon might have been influenced, if not built, by the Aztecs. It's important, even groundbreaking stuff." Then he silenced her with a faint pressure to her hand. "I wasn't aware of the cuts to your apartment." "Cuts in your apartment, Nora. Department, Nora. We've all had to tighten our belts, but perhaps we've done so a little too indiscriminately." Nora couldn't help glancing at Brisbane, but his face had shut down completely. It was unreadable. "Fortunately, we are in a position to restore your funding, and, on top of that, give you the 18,000 you need for those critical carbon-14 dates. I myself have a personal interest in the subject. I'll never forget, as a boy, visiting those magnificent Cacoan ruins with Dr. Morse himself. Thank you, but—" Again, the faint squeeze. "Please don't thank me. Mr. Brisbane was kind enough to bring this situation to my attention. The work you are doing here is important. It will bring credit to the museum, and I personally would like to do anything I can to support it. If you need anything else, call me. Call me." He released her hand ever so gently and turned to Brisbane. "I must be off to prepare my little speech. Thank you." Thank you." And he was gone. She looked at Brisbane, but the face was still an opaque mask. "Now you know what will happen if you do get with the program," he said. "I'd rather not go into what will happen if you don't." Brisbane turned back to the mirror, gave himself one last look. "See you tonight, Dr. Kelly," he said, mildly. Chapter 12. O'Shaughnessy followed Pendergast up the red-carpeted steps toward the museum's great bronze doors, convinced that every eye in the place was on him. He felt like a jerk in his policeman's uniform. He let his hand drop idly to the butt of his gun, and felt gratified as a nearby tuxedoed man gave him a decidedly nervous glance. He further consoled himself with the thought that he was getting time and a half for this dog and pony show, and time and a half from Captain Custer was nothing to sneeze at. Cars were lining up along Museum Drive, disgorging beautiful and not-so-beautiful people. Velvet ropes held back a small, disconsolate-looking group of photographers and journalists. The flashes of the photographers' cameras were few and far between. A van with the logo of a local television station was already packing up and leaving. "This opening for the new Primate Hall is rather smaller than others I've attended," said Pendergast as he glanced around. "Party fatigue, I expect. The museum's been having so many these days." "Primates? All these people are interested in monkeys." "I expect most of them are here to observe the primates outside the exhibition cases." "Very funny." They passed through the doors and across the great rotunda. Until 2 days ago, O'Shaughnessy hadn't been inside the museum since he was a kid. But there were the dinosaurs, just like they'd always been. And beyond, the herd of elephants. The The red carpet and velvet ropes led them onward, deeper into the building. Smiling young ladies were positioned along the way, pointing, nodding, indicating where to go. Very nice young ladies, O'Shaughnessy decided. But O'Shaughnessy decided that another visit to the museum, when he wasn't on duty, might be in order. They wound to the African Hall, past a massive doorway framed in elephant tusks, and entered a large reception area. Countless little tables, set with votive candles, dotted the room. A vast buffet heaped with food ran along one wall, bookended by two well-stocked booze stations. A podium had been placed at the far end of the room. In a nearby corner, a string quartet sawed industriously at a Venetian waltz. Viennese waltz. O'Shaughnessy listened with incredulity. They were appalling. But at least it wasn't Puccini they were butchering. The room was almost empty. At the door stood a manic-looking man, a large name tag displayed below his white carnation. He spotted Pendergast, rushed over, and seized his hand with almost frantic gratitude. "Harry Muttaker, Head of Public Relations. Thank you for coming, sir. Thank you. I think you'll love the new hall." "Primate behavior is my specialty." "Ah, then you've come to the right place." The PR man caught a glimpse of O'Shaughnessy and froze in the act of pumping Pendergast's hand. "I'm sorry, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice had lost all its conviviality. "Yeah," said O'Shaughnessy in his most menacing tone. The man leaned forward and spoke in most unwelcoming tones. "This is a private opening, officer. I'm sorry, but you'll have to leave. We have no need of outside security." "Oh, yeah? Just so you know, Harry, I'm here on the little matter of the museum cocaine ring." "Museum cocaine ring?" Medeker looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Officer O'Shaughnessy," came Pendergast's mild warning. O'Shaughnessy gave the man a little clap on the shoulder. "Don't breathe a word. Imagine how the press would run with it. Think of the museum, Harry." He left the man white and shaking. "I hate it when they don't respect the man in blue," said O'Shaughnessy. For a moment, Pendergast eyed him gravely. Then he nodded toward the buffet. "Regulations may forbid drinking on the job, but they don't forbid eating blini au caviar." "Blini au what?" "Tiny buckwheat pancakes topped with creme fraiche and caviar." "Delectable." O'Shaughnessy shuddered. "I don't like raw fish eggs." "I suspect you've never had the real thing, Sergeant. Give one a try. You'll find them much more palatable than a Diwoko aria, I assure you. However, there's also the smoked sturgeon, the foie gras, the prosciutto di Parma, and the Damascata River oysters. The museum always serves an excellent table. Just give me the pigs in a blanket." "Those can be obtained from the man with the cart on the corner of 70th set." Wow, I am out of practice. Second, folks. Gonna take a breath. "Those can be obtained from the man with the cart on the corner of 77th and Central Park West." More people were trickling into the hall, but the crowd was still thin. O'Shaughnessy followed Pendergast over to the food table. He avoided the piles of sticky gray fish eggs. Instead, he took a few pieces of ham, cut a slice from a wheel of brie, and, with some pieces of French bread, made a couple of small ham and cheese sandwiches for himself. The ham was a little dry, and the cheese tasted a little like ammonia, but overall it was palatable. You had a meeting with Captain Custer, right? Pendergast asked. How did it go? O'Shaughnessy shook his head as he munched. Not too good. I expect there was someone from the mayor's office. Mary Hill. Ah, Miss Hill. Of course. Captain Custer wanted to know why I hadn't told them about the journal. Why I hadn't told them about the dress. Why I hadn't told them about the note. But it was all in the report, which Custer hadn't read. So in the end, I survived the meeting. Pendergast nodded. Thanks for helping me finish the report. Otherwise, they'd have ripped me a new one. What a quaint expression. Pendergast looked over O'Shaughnessy's shoulder. Sergeant, I'd like to introduce you to an old acquaintance of mine. William Smithback. O'Shaughnessy turned to see a gangling, awkward-looking man at the buffet, a gravity-defying cowlick jutting from the top of his head. He was dressed in an ill-fitting tuxedo, and he seemed utterly absorbed in piling as much food onto his plate as possible, as quickly as possible. The man looked over, saw Pendergast, and started visibly. He glanced around uneasily, as if marking possible exits. But the FBI agent was smiling encouragingly, and the man named Smithback came toward them a little warily. Agent Pendergast, Smithback said in a nasal baritone. What a surprise! Indeed. Mr. Smithback, I find you well. He grasped Smithback's hand and shook it. How many years has it been? Long time, said Smithback, looking like it had not been nearly long enough. What are you doing in New York? I keep an apartment here. Pendergast released the hand and looked the writer up and down. I see you've graduated to Armani, Mr. Smithback, he said. A rather better cut than those off-the-rack 14th Street job lot suits you used to sport. However, when you're ready to take a real sartorial step, might I recommend Brioni or Ermenegildo Zegna? Or is it Zena? Is the G silent? Armeni. Wow, I've never seen the full name. Smithback opened his mouth to reply, but Pendergast continued smoothly. I heard from Margot Green, by the way. She's up in Boston, working for the Gene Dine Corporation. She asked me to remember her to you. Smithback opened his mouth again, shut it. Thank you, he managed after a moment. And Lieutenant D'Agosta, you keep in touch? Baritone, deep. Falsetto, high. Can I do a nasally baritone? Dots. Where was I? Okay. And Lieutenant D'Agosta. You keep in touch with him? He also went north. He's now living in Canada, writing police procedurals under the pen name of Campbell Dirk. I'll have to pick up one of his books. He hasn't made it big yet. Not like you, Mr. Smithback. But I must say the books are readable. By this point, Smithback had fully recovered. And mine aren't. Pendergast inclined his head. I can't honestly say I have read any. Do you have one you could particularly recommend? Very funny, said Smithback, frowning and looking about. I wonder if Nora's going to be here. So you're the guy who wrote the article, right? Asked O'Shaughnessy. Smithback nodded. Made a splash, don't you think? It certainly got everyone's attention, said Pendergast dryly. As well as it should. 19th century serial killer, kidnapping and mutilating helpless kids from workhouses, all in the name of some experiment to extend his own wretched life. You know, They've awarded Pulitzers for less than that. People were arriving more quickly now, and the noise level was increasing. The Society for American Archaeology is demanding an investigation into how the site came to be destroyed. I understand the construction union is also asking questions with this upcoming election. The mayor's on the defensive. As you can imagine, Morgan Fairhaven wasn't terribly happy about it. Speak of the devil. No, that was Pendergast. Dang it. What? Smithback said, clearly surprised by this sudden remark. Anthony Fairhaven, Pendergast said, nodding toward the entrance. This is terribly unprofessional of me. But then again, working on being professional, I would like to go back to that section and read it in the proper voice. The Society for American Archaeology is demanding an investigation into how the site came to be destroyed. I understand the construction union is also asking questions. With this upcoming election, the mayor's on the defensive. As you can imagine, Morgan Fairhaven wasn't terribly happy about it. Speak of the devil. What? Smithback said, clearly surprised by this sudden remark. Anthony Fairhaven, Pendergast said, nodding toward the entrance. O'Shaughnessy followed the glance. The man standing in the doorway to the hall was much more useful than he'd expected. Fit, with the kind of frame a bicyclist or rock climber might have. Wiry, athletic. His tuxedo draped over his shoulders and chest with a lightness that made him look as if he'd been born in it. Even more surprising was the face. It was an open face, an honest-looking face, not the face of the rapacious, money-grubbing real estate developer Smithback had portrayed in the Times article. Then, most surprising of all, Fairhaven looked their way, noticed their glance, and smiled broadly at them before continuing into the hall. A hissing came over the PA system. Tales from the Vienna woods died away raggedly. No, wait. Tales from the Vienna woods died away raggedly. A man was at the podium doing a sound check. He retreated, and a hush fell on the crowd. After a moment, a second man, wearing a formal suit, mounted the podium and walked to the microphone. He looked grave, intelligent, patrician, dignified, at ease. In short, he was everything O'Shaughnessy hated. "Who's that?" he asked. "The distinguished Dr. Frederick Cullopy," said Pendergast, "director of the museum." "He's got a 29-year-old wife," Smithback whispered. "Can you believe it? It's a wonder he can even find the... Look, there she is now." He pointed to a young and extremely attractive woman standing to one side. Unlike the other women, who all seemed to be dressed in black, she was wearing an emerald green gown with an elegant diamond tiara. The combination was breathtaking. "Oh, God," Smithback breathed. "What a stunner." "I hope the guy keeps a pair of cardiac paddles on his bedside table," O'Shaughnessy muttered. "I think I'll go over and give him my number. Offer to spell him one of these nights, in case the old geezer gets winded." "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," began Cullopy. His voice was low, gravelly, without inflection. "When I was a young man, I understood the reclassification of the Poingidae, the great apes." The level of conversation in the room dropped, but did not cease altogether. People seemed far more interested in food and drink than in hearing this man talk about monkeys, O'Shaughnessy thought. And I was faced with a problem. Where to put mankind? Are we in the Pongidae, or are we not? Are we a great ape, or are we something special? This was the question I faced. Here comes Dr. Kelly, said Pendergast. Smithback turned, an eager, expectant, nervous look on his face. But the tall, copper-haired woman swept past him without so much as a glance, arrowing straight for the food table. Hey, Nora, I've been trying to reach you all day. O'Shaughnessy watched the writer hustle after her, then returned his attention to his ham and cheese sandwiches. He was glad he didn't have to do this sort of thing for a living. How could they bear it? Standing around, chatting aimlessly, with people you'd never seen before or would never see again, trying to cough up a vestige of interest in their vapid opinions, all to a background obligato of speechifying. It seemed inconceivable to him that there were people who actually liked going to parties like this. Our closest living relatives. Smithback was returning already. His tuxedo front was splattered with fish eggs and creme fraiche. He looked stricken. Have an accident? Asked Pendergast dryly. You might call it that. O'Shaughnessy glanced over and saw Nora heading straight for the retreating Smithback. She did not look happy. Nora, Smithback began again. She rounded on him, her face furious. How could you? I gave you that information in confidence. But, Nora, I did it for you. Don't you see? Now they can't touch... You moron! My long-term career here is ruined. After what happened in Utah, and with the Lloyd Museum closing, this job was my last chance. And you ruined it! Nora, if you could only look at it my way, you promised me. And I trusted you. God, I can't believe it. I'm totally screwed. She looked away, then whirled back with redoubled ferocity. Was this some kind of revenge I wouldn't rent that apartment with you? Because I wouldn't rent that apartment with you? No, Nora, just the opposite. It was to help you. I swear in the end you'll thank me. The poor man looked so helpless. O'Shaughnessy felt sorry for him. He was obviously in love with the woman, and he had just as obviously blown it completely. Suddenly, she turned to Pendergast. And you! Pendergast raised his eyebrows and carefully placed a blini back on his plate. Sneaking around the museum? Picking locks? Fermenting suspicion? You started all this! Pendergast bowed. If I have caused you any distress, Dr. Kelly, I regret it deeply. Distress? They're going to crucify me. And there it all was in today's paper. I could kill you. All of you! Her voice had risen, and now people were looking at her instead of at the man at the podium, still droning on about classifying his great apes. Then Pendergast said, Smile. Our friend Brisbane is watching. Nora glanced over her shoulder. O'Shaughnessy followed the glance toward the podium and saw a well-groomed man, tall, glossy, with slicked-back dark hair, staring at them. He did not look happy. Nora shook her head and lowered her voice. Jesus, I'm not even supposed to be talking to you. I can't believe the position you've put me in. However, Dr. Kelly, you and I do need to talk, Pendergast said softly. Meet me tomorrow evening at 10 Wren's Tea and Ginseng Company, 75 Mott Street, at 7 o'clock. If you please. Nora glared at him angrily, and stalked off. Immediately, Brisbane glided over on long legs, planting himself in front of them. What a pleasant surprise, he said in a chill undertone. The FBI agent, the policeman, and the reporter. An unholy trinity, if I ever saw one. Pendergast inclined his head. And how are you, Mr. Brisbane? Oh, top form. I'm glad to hear it. I don't recall any of you being on the guest list. Especially you, Mr. Smithback. How did you slither past security? Pendergast smiled and spoke gently. Sergeant O'Shaughnessy and I are here on law enforcement business. As for Mr. Smithback, well, I'm sure he would like nothing more than to be tossed out on his ear. What a marvelous follow-up that would be to his piece in today's edition of The Times. Smithback nodded. Thank you. It would. Brisbane stood still, a smile frozen on his face. He looked first at Pendergast, then at Smithback. His eyes raked Smithback's soiled tucks. Didn't your mother teach you that caviar goes in the mouth, not on the shirt? He walked off. Imbecile, Smithback murmured. Don't underestimate him, replied Pendergast. He is Mogan Fairhaven, the museum, and the mayor behind him. And he is no imbecile. Yeah, except that I'm a reporter for the New York Times. Don't make the mistake of thinking even that lofty position will protect you. And now, without more ado, let us unveil the museum's latest creation, the Hall of Primates. O'Shaughnessy watched as a ribbon beside the podium was cut with an oversized pair of scissors. There was a smattering of applause, and a general drift toward the open doors of the new hall beyond. Pendergast glanced at him. Shall we? Why not? Anything was better than standing around here. Count me out, said Smithback. I've seen enough exhibitions in this joint to last me a lifetime. Pendergast turned and grasped the reporter's hand. I am sure we shall meet again soon. It seemed to O'Shaughnessy that Smithback fairly flinched. Soon they were through the doors. People drifted along the spacious hall, which was lined with dioramas of stuffed chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and various monkeys and lemurs, displayed in their native habitats. Habitats? Habitats. I'm drifting into new accents. With some surprise, O'Shaughnessy realized the dioramas were fascinating, beautiful in their own way. They were like magic casements opening onto distant worlds. How had these morons done it? But of course, they hadn't done it. It was the curator and artists who had. Curators. People like Brisbane were the dead wood at the top of the pile. He really needed to come here more often. He saw a knot of people gathering around one case, which displayed a hooting chimpanzee swinging on a tree limb. There was whispered conversation, muffled laughter. It didn't look any different from the other cases, and yet it seemed to have attracted half the people in the hallway. O'Shaughnessy wondered what was so interesting about that chimpanzee. He looked about. Pendergast was in a far corner, examining some strange little monkey with intense interest. Funny man. A little scary, actually, when you got right down to it. He strolled over to check on the case, standing at the fringe of the crowd. There were more murmurs, some stifled laughter, some disapproving clucks. A bejeweled lady was gesturing for a guard. When people noticed O'Shaughnessy was a cop, they automatically shuffled aside. He saw that an elaborate label had been attached to the case. The label was made from a plaque of richly grained oak, on which gold letters were edged in black. It read, Roger C. Brisbane III, First Vice President. Chapter 13. The box was made of fruit wood. It had lain untouched and unneeded for many decades, and was now covered in a heavy mantle of dust. But it had only taken one swipe of a soft velour cloth to remove the sediment of years, and a second swipe to bring out the rich, mellow sheen of the wood beneath. Next, the cloth moved toward the brass corners, rubbing and burnishing, and the brass hinges, shined and lightly oiled. Finally came the gold nameplate, fastened to the lid by 4 tiny screws. It was only when every inch, every element of the box had been polished to brilliance that the fingers moved toward the latch, and, trembling slightly with the gravity of the moment, unsnapped the lock, lifted the lid. Within, the tools gleamed from the beds of purple velvet. The fingers moved from one to the next, touching each lightly, almost reverently, as if they could impart some healing gift. As indeed they could, and had, and would again. First came the large amputation knife, its blade curved downward, as did all American amputation knives made between the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. In fact, this particular set dated from the 1840s, crafted by Wigand and Snowden of Philadelphia. An exquisite set, a work of art. The fingers moved on, a solitary ring of cat's eye opal winking conspiratorially in the subdued light. Metacarpal saw, Catalan knife, bone forceps, tissue forceps. At last, the fingers stopped on the capital saw. They caressed its length for a moment, then teased it from its molded slot. It was a beauty, long, built for business, its heavy blade breathtakingly sharp. As with the rest of the tools, its handle was made of ivory and gutta percha. It was not until the 1880s, when Leicester's work on germs was published, that surgical instruments began to be sterilized. All handles from that point on were made of metal. Porous materials became mere collector's items. A pity, really. The old tools were so much more attractive. It was a comfort to know that there would be no need for sterilization here. The box contained 2 trays. With worshipful care, the fingers removed the upper tray, the amputation set, to expose the still greater beauty of the neurosurgical set below. Rows of skull trephines lay beside the more delicate saw blades, and encircling the rest was the greatest treasure of all, a medical chainsaw. A long, thin band of metal covered in sharp, serrated teeth. Ivory hand grips at each end. It actually belonged among the amputation tools, but its great length consigned it to the lower tray. That was the thing to use when time, not delicacy, was of the essence. It was a horrifying-looking tool. It was consummately beautiful. The fingers brushed each item in turn. Then, carefully, the upper tray was lowered back into position. A heavy leather strop was brought from a nearby table and laid before the open box. The fingers rubbed a small amount of neatsfoot oil into the strop, slowly, without hurry. It was important that there would no longer be any hurry. Hurry had always meant mistakes, wasted effort. At last, the fingers returned to the box, selected a knife, brought it to the light. Then, with lingering, loving care, laid it against the leather strop and began stroking back and forth, back and forth. The leather seemed almost to purr as the blade was stropped. To sharpen all the blades in the surgical set to a razor edge would take many hours. But then, there would be time. There would, in fact, be nothing but time. New section. The appointed time. Chapter 1. Paul Karp could hardly believe he was actually going to get home. Finally. 17 years old, and now finally he was going to get some. Get home? Get some. He pulled the girl deeper into the ramble. It was the wildest, least visited part of Central Park. It wasn't perfect, but would have to do. "Why don't we just go back to your place?" the girl asked. "My folks are home." Paul put his arms around her and kissed her. "Don't worry. This is great, right here." Her face was flushed, and he could hear her breathing. He looked ahead for the darkest, the most private place he could find. Quickly, unwilling to lose the moment, he turned off the paved walk and plunged into the thicket of rhododendron bushes. She was following, gladly. The thought sent a little shiver of anticipation coursing through him. It only seemed deserted. It only seemed deserted, he told himself. People came in here all the time. He pushed his way into the densest part of the thicket. Even though the autumn sun still hovered low in the sky, the canopy of sycamores, laurels, and azaleas created a verdant half-light. Azaleas, not azazels. It's not an angel, it's a flower. He tried to tell himself it was cozy, almost romantic. Finally, they came to a hidden spot, a thick bed of myrtle surrounded by dark bushes. No one would see them here. They were utterly alone. "Paul, what if a mugger—" "No mugger is going to see us in here," he quickly said, taking the girl in his arms and kissing her. She responded, first hesitantly, then more eagerly. "Are you sure this place is okay?" she whispered. "Sure. We're totally alone." After a last look around, Paul lay down on the myrtle, pulling her beside him. They kissed again. Paul slid his hands up her blouse, and she didn't stop him. He could feel her chest heaving, breasts rising and falling. The birds made a racket over their heads, and the myrtle rose around them like a thick, green carpet. It was very nice. Paul thought this was a great way for it to happen. He could tell the story later, but the important thing was that it was going to happen. No longer would it be a joke among his friends, the last virgin of Horace Mann's senior class. With renewed urgency, he pressed closer to her, undid some buttons. "Don't push so hard," she whispered, squirming. "The ground is bumpy." "Sorry." They wriggled on the thick myrtle, searching for a more comfortable spot. "Now there's a branch sticking into my back." Suddenly, she stopped. "What?" "I heard a rustle." "It's just the wind." Paul shifted some more, and they embraced again. His fingers felt thick and awkward as he unzipped her pants, unbuttoned the rest of her shirt. Her breasts swung free, and at the sight he felt himself grow even harder. He put his hand on her bare midriff, sliding it downward. Her much more expert hand reached him first. As she took him in her cool, gentle grasp, he gasped, and you know the rest. "Ouch! Wait, there's still a branch underneath me." She sat up, breathing hard, her blonde hair falling over her shoulders. Paul sat up too, frustration mingling with desire. He could see the flattened area where they had been lying. The myrtle was crushed, and beneath he could see the outline of the light-colored branch. He stuck his hand through the myrtle and grabbed it, yanking at it angrily, struggling to wrest it free. "God-damn branch!" But something was very wrong. It felt strange, cold, rubbery. And as it came up out of the myrtle, he saw it wasn't a branch at all, but an arm. Leaves slid away, exposing the rest of the body, langorously, unwillingly. As his fingers went slack, the arm fell away again, flopping back into the greenery. The girl screamed first, scrambling backward, standing, tripping, standing up again and running, jeans unzipped and shirt flapping around her. Paul was on his feet, but all he seemed to be able to hear was her crashing through the undergrowth. It had all happened so fast, it seemed like some sort of dream. He could feel the lust dying away within him, horror flooding in to take its place. He turned to run. Then he paused and glanced wildly back, driven by some impulse to see if it were actually real. The fingers were partly curled, white skin smeared with mud. And in the dimness beyond, under the thick undergrowth, lay the rest. Chapter 2. Dr. Bill Dowson lounged against the sink, examining his precisely trimmed fingernails without interest. One more, then lunch. Thank God. A cup of coffee and a BLT at the corner deli would hit the spot. He wasn't sure why he wanted a BLT, exactly. Maybe it was the lividity of the last stiff that started him thinking about bacon. Anyway, the Dominican behind the deli counter had elevated the sandwich into an art form. Dowson could practically taste the crisp lettuce, the tang of tomato against the mayonnaise. The nurse brought in the clipboard, and he glanced up. She had short black hair and a trim body. She glanced at the clipboard without picking it up and smiled at her. "What have we here?" he asked. "Homicide." He gave an exaggerated sigh, rolled his eyes. "What is that? The 4th today? Must be hunting season. Gunshot?" "No. Some kind of multiple stabbing. They found it in Central Park, in the Ramble." He nodded. "The dumping ground, eh? Figures. Great. Another piece of shit killing." He glanced at his watch. "Bring it in, please." He watched the nurse walk out. Nice. Very nice. She returned a moment later with a gurney, covered by a green sheet. He made no move toward the body. "So how about that dinner tonight?" The nurse smiled. "I don't think it's a good idea, Doctor." "Why not?" "I've told you before, I don't date doctors, especially ones I work with." He nodded, pushed down his glasses, and grinned. "But I'm your soulmate, remember?" She smiled. "Hardly." But he could tell she was flattered by his interest. "Better not push it, though. Not these days. Sexual harassment and all that." He sighed, eased himself off the sink. Then he pulled a fresh pair of gloves on. "Turn on the video cams," he said to the nurse as he prepped. "Yes, doctor." He picked up the clipboard. "Says here we have a Caucasian woman, identified as Doreen Hollinger, age 27, of Pine Creek, Oklahoma, identified by her husband." He scanned the rest of the top sheet. Then he hung the clipboard on the gurney, drew on a surgical mask, and with the nurse's help, lifted the sheeted corpse onto the stainless steel examining table. He sensed a presence behind him and turned. In the doorway was a tall, slender man. His face and hands looked remarkably pale against the black of his suit. Behind the man stood a uniformed cop. "Yes?" Dowson asked. The man approached, opening his wallet. "I'm Special Agent Pendergast, Dr. Dowson, and this is Sergeant O'Shaughnessy of the NYPD." Dowson looked him over. This was very irregular, and there was something strange about the man. Hair so very blonde, eyes so very pale. Accent so very, very southern. And, may I observe, this an FBI case? No. Where's your clearance? I don't have one. Dowson sighed with irritation. You know the rules. You can't just watch for the hell of it. The FBI agent took a step closer to him, closer than he liked, invading his personal space. He controlled an impulse to step backward. Look, Mr. Pendergast, get the necessary paperwork and come back, okay? That will be time-consuming, said the man named Pendergast. It will hold you up considerably. I would appreciate your courtesy in letting us observe. There was something in the man's tone that sounded a lot harder than the mellifluous accent and genteel words suggested. Dowson hesitated. Look, with all due respect, Dr. Dowson, I'm in no mood to bandy civilities with you. Proceed with the autopsy. The voice was now cold as dry ice. Dowson remembered the videocam was on. He glanced covertly at the nurse. He had a strong sense that a humiliation at the hands of this man might just be around the corner. This would not look good, and it might cause trouble later. The guy was FBI after all. Anyway, his own ass was covered. He was on record stating the man needed clearance. Dowson sighed. All right, Pendergast. You and the sergeant, don scrubs. He waited until they returned, then pulled back the sheet with a single motion. The cadaver lay on its back, blonde hair, young, fresh. The chill of the previous night had kept it from decomposing. Dowson leaned toward the mic and began a description. The FBI man was looking at the corpse with interest, but Dowson could see that the uniformed cop was beginning to look uneasy, shifting from one foot to another, lips pressed tight together. The last thing he needed was a puker. Is he going to be all right? Dowson asked Pendergast in an undertone, nodding to the cop. Pendergast turned. You don't have to see this, Sergeant. The cop swallowed, glancing from the corpse to Pendergast and back again. I'll be in the lounge. Drop your scrubs in the bin on your way out, said Dawson with sarcastic satisfaction. Pendergast watched the cop leave. Then he turned to Dawson. I suggest you turn the body over before making your Y incision. And why is that? Pendergast nodded toward the clipboard. Page 2. Dawson picked it up, flipped over the top page. Extensive lacerations, deep knife wounds. Looked like the girl had been stabbed repeatedly in the lower back. Or worse. As usual, it was hard to make out from the police report what had actually taken place. From a medical standpoint, there had been no investigating ME. It had been given a low priority. This Dorian Hollander didn't count for much, it seemed. Dawson returned the clipboard. Sue, help me turn her over. They turned the body, exposing the back. The nurse gasped and stepped away. Dawson stared in surprise. Looks like she died on the operating table, in the middle of an operation to remove a spinal tumor. Had they screwed up again downstairs? Just last week, twice, they had sent him the wrong paperwork with the wrong corpse. But immediately, Dawson realized this was no hospital stiff. Not with dirt and leaves sticking to the raw wound that had covered the entire lower back and sacrum area. This was weird. Seriously weird. He peered closer and began describing the wound for the benefit of the camera, trying to keep the surprise out of his voice. Superficially, this does not resemble the random knife slashing, stabbing, or cutting described in the report. It has the appearance of a dissection. The incision, if it is one, begins about 10 inches below the scapula and 7 inches above the belt line. It appears as if the entire cauda equina has been dissected, starting at L1 and terminating at the sacrum. At this, the FBI agent looked at him abruptly. The dissection includes the filum terminale. Dowson bent closer. Nurse, sponge along here. The nurse removed some of the debris around the wound. The room had fallen silent, except for the whir of the camera, and there was a clattering sound as twigs and leaves slid into the table's drainage channel. The spinal cord, more precisely the cauda equina, is missing. It has been removed. The dissection extends peripherally to the neuroforamen and out to the transverse processes. Nurse, irrigate L1 to L5. The nurse quickly irrigated the requested area. The dissection has stripped off the skin, the subcutaneous tissue, and paraspinous musculature, or paraspinous. It appears as if a self-retaining retractor was used. Self-retaining retractor. I can see the marks of it here, and here, and here. He carefully indicated the areas for the benefit of the video. The spinous processes and laminae have been removed, along with the ligamentum flavum. The dura is still present. There is a longitudinal incision in the dura from L1 to the sacrum, allowing full removal of the cord. It has the appearance of a very professional incision. Nurse, the stereozoom. The nurse rolled over a large microscope. Quickly, Dowson inspected the spinous processes. It looks as if a rongier has been used to remove the processes and laminae from the dura. I am not caught up in medical terms because I am not a med student, so there will be stumbling. He straightened up, running a gowned arm across his forehead. This was not a standard dissection one would do in medical school. It was more like the kind of thing neurosurgeons practiced in advanced neuroanatomy classes. Then he remembered the FBI agent, Pendergast. He glanced at him to see how he was taking it. He had seen a lot of shocked people at autopsies, but nothing like this. The man looked, not shocked exactly, so much as grim death himself. The man spoke. "Doctor, may I interrupt with a few questions?" Dowson nodded. "Was this dissection the cause of death?" There was a new thought to Dawson. He shuddered. If the subject were alive when this was done, yes, it would have caused death. At what point? As soon as the incision was made in the dura. The cerebrospinal fluid would have drained. That alone would have been enough to cause death. He examined the wound again. It looked as if the operation had caused a great deal of bleeding from the epidural veins, and some of them had retracted, an indication of live trauma. Yet the dissector had not worked around the veins, as a surgeon on a live patient would have done, but had cut right through them. The operation, while done with great skill, had also apparently been done with haste. A large number of veins had been cut, and only the largest, whose bleeding would have interfered with the work, have been ligated. The subject might have bled to death before the opening of the dura, depending on how fast the person worked. But was the subject alive when the operation began? It seems she was. Dawson swallowed weakly. However, it seems no effort was made to keep the subject alive while the dissection was progressing. I would suggest some blood and tissue work to see if the subject had been tranquilized. The doctor nodded. It's standard. In your opinion, doctor, how professional was this dissection? Dowson did not answer. He was trying to order his thoughts. This had the potential of being big and unpleasant. For the time being, no doubt they'd try to keep a low profile on this, try to fly it as long as possible beneath the radar of the New York press. But it would come out, as it always did. And then there would be a lot of people second-guessing his actions. He'd better slow down, take it one step at a time. This was not the run-of-the-mill murder the police report indicated. Thank God he hadn't actually begun the autopsy. He had the FBI agent to thank for that. He turned to the nurse. "Get Jones up here with the large format camera and the camera for the stereo zoom. And I want a second ME to assist. Who's on call?" "Dr. Lofton." "I need him within the half hour. I also want the consult with our neurosurgeon, Dr. Feldman. Get him up here as soon as possible." "Yes, doctor." He turned to Pendergast. "I'm not sure I can let you stay without some kind of official sanction." To his surprise, the man seemed to accept this. "I understand, doctor. I believe this autopsy is in good hands. I, personally, have seen enough." "So have I," thought Dawson. He now felt sure that a surgeon had done this. The thought made him feel sick. O'Shaughnessy stood in the lounge. He debated whether to buy a cup of coffee from a vending machine, and then decided against it. He felt distinctly embarrassed. Here he was, supposed to be a tough, sardonic New York City cop, and he'd wimped out. All but tossed his cookies right there on the examining room floor. The sight of that poor, chubby, naked girl on the table, blue and dirty, her young face all puffed up, eyes open, leaves and sticks in her hair. He shuddered afresh at the image. He also felt a burning anger for the person who had done it. He wasn't a homicide cop. He never wanted to be one, even in the early days. He hated the sight of blood. But his own sister-in-law lived in Oklahoma, about this girl's age, too. Now, he felt he could stand whatever it took to catch that killer. Pendergast glided through the stainless steel doors like a wraith. He barely glanced at O'Shaughnessy. The sergeant fell into step behind him, and they left the building and climbed into the waiting car in silence. Something had definitely put Pendergast into a black mood. The guy was moody, but this was the darkest he had ever seen him. O'Shaughnessy still had no idea why Pendergast was so suddenly interested in this new murder, interrupting his work on the 19th century killings. But, somehow, this didn't seem to be the time to ask. "We will drop the sergeant off at the precinct house," said Pendergast to his chauffeur, "and then you may take me home." Pendergast settled back in the leather seat. O'Shaughnessy looked over at him. "What happened?" he managed to ask. "What did you see?" Pendergast looked out his window. "Evil." And he spoke no more. Chapter 3. William Smithback Jr., in his best suit, the Armani, recently dry-cleaned, crispest white shirt, and most businesslike tie, stood on the corner of Avenue of the Americas and 55th Street. His eyes strayed upward along the vast glass and chrome monolith that was the Moog and Fairhaven building, rippling blue-green in the sunlight like some vast slab of water. Somewhere in that $100 million pile was his prey. He felt pretty sure he could talk his way into seeing Fairhaven. He was good at that kind of thing. This assignment was a lot more promising than that tourist murder in the Ramble his editor had wanted him to cover today. He conjured up the grizzled face of his editor, red eyes bug-big behind thick glasses, smoke-cured finger pointing, telling him that this dead lady from Oklahoma was going to be big. Big? Tourists were getting smoked all the time in New York City. It was too bad, but there it was. Homicide reporting was hack work. He had a hunch about Fairhaven, the museum, and these old killings Pendergast was so interested in. He always trusted his hunches. His editor wouldn't be disappointed. He was going to cast his fly onto the water, and by God, Fairhaven might just bite. Taking one more deep breath, he crossed the street, giving the finger to a cabbie that shot past, inches away, horn blaring, and approached the granite and titanium entry. Another vast acreage of granite greeted him upon entering the interior. There was a large desk, manned by half a dozen security officers, and several banks of elevators beyond. Smithback strode resolutely toward the security desk. He leaned on it aggressively. "I'm here to see Mr. Fairhaven." "Pardon?" The closest guard was shuffling through a computer printout. "Name?" he asked, not bothering to look up. "William Smithback, Jr., of the New York Times." "Moment," mumbled the guard, picking up a telephone. He dialed, then handed it to Smithback. A crisp voice sounded. "May I help you?" "This is William Smithback, Jr., of the New York Times. I'm here to see Mr. Fairhaven." It was Saturday, but Smithback was gambling he'd be in his office. Guys like Fairhaven never took Saturdays off. And on Saturdays, they were usually less fortified with secretaries and guards. "Do you have an appointment?" the female voice asked, reaching down to him from 50 stories. "No. I'm the reporter doing the story in Enoch Lang and the bodies found at the job site on Catherine Street, and I need to speak with him immediately. It's urgent." "You need to call for an appointment." It was an utterly neutral voice. "Good. Consider this the call. I'd like to make an appointment for—" Smithback checked his watch. 10 o'clock. "Mr. Fairhaven is presently engaged," the voice instantly responded. Smithback took a deep breath. So he was in. Time to press the attack. There were probably 10 layers of secretaries beyond the one on the phone, but he'd gotten through that many before. "Look, if Mr. Fairhaven is too busy to talk to me, I'll just have to report in the article I'm writing for the Monday edition that he refused to comment." "He is presently engaged," the robotic voice repeated. "No comment. That'll do wonders for his public image. And come Monday, Mr. Fairhaven will be wanting to know who in his office turned away the reporter. Get my drift?" There was a long silence. Smithback drew in some more air. This was often a long process. You know when you're reading an article in the paper, and it's about some sleazy guy, and the guy says, "I have no comment"? How does that make you feel about that guy? Especially a real estate developer. No comment. I could do a lot with no comment. There was more silence. Smithback wondered if she had hung up. But no, there was a sound on a line. It was a chuckle. "That's good," said a low, pleasant, masculine voice. "I like that. Nicely done." "Who's this?" Smithback demanded. "Just some sleazy real estate developer." "Who?" Smithback was not going to stand being made fun of by some lackey. "Anthony Fairhaven." "Oh." Smithback was momentarily struck speechless. He recovered quickly. "Mr. Fairhaven, is it true that— Why don't you come on up so we can talk face to face, like grown-up people? 49th floor. "What?" Smithback was still surprised at the rapidity of his success. "I said, come up. I was wondering when you'd call, being the ambitious, careerist reporter that you so evidently are." Fairhaven's office was not quite what Smithback had envisioned. True, there were several layers of secretaries and assistants guarding the sanctum sanctorum, but when he finally gained Fairhaven's office, it wasn't the vast screw-you space of chrome gold, ebony, old master paintings, African primitives he expected. It was rather simple and small. True, there was art on the walls, but it consisted of some understated Thomas Hart Benton lithographs of Yemen farmers. Beside these was a glassed panel, locked and clearly alarmed, containing a variety of handguns, mounted on black velvet backdrop. The sole desk was small and made of birch. There were a couple of easy chairs and a worn Persian rug on the floor. One wall was covered with bookshelves, filled with books that had clearly been read instead of purchased by the yard as furniture. Except for the gun case, it looked more like a professor's office than that of a real estate magnate. And yet, unlike any professor's office Smithback had ever been in, the space was meticulously clean. Every surface sparkled with an unblemished shine. Even the books appeared to have been polished. There was a faint smell of cleaning agents, a little chemical, but not unpleasant. "Please, sit down," said Fairhaven, sweeping a hand toward the easy chairs. "Would you care for anything? Coffee? Water? Soda? Whiskey?" He grinned. "Nothing, thanks," said Smithback as he took a seat. He felt the familiar shudder of expectation that came before an intense interview. Fairhaven was clearly savvy, but he was rich and pampered. He no doubt lacked street smarts. Smithback had interviewed, and skewered, dozens like him. It wouldn't even be a contest. Fairhaven opened a refrigerator and took out a small bottle of mineral water. He poured himself a glass and then sat, not at his desk, but in an easy chair opposite Smithback. He crossed his legs, smiled. The bottle of water sparkled in the sunlight that slanted through the windows. Smithback glanced past him, and the view, at least, was killer. He turned his attention back to the man. Black, wavy hair, strong brow, athletic frame, easy movements, sardonic look in the eye. Could be 30, 35. He jotted a few impressions. "So," Fairhaven said with a small, self-deprecating smile, "the sleazy real estate developer is ready to take your questions. May I record this?" "I would expect no less." Smithback slipped a recorder out of his pocket. Of course, he seemed charming. People like him were experts at charm and manipulation. But he'd never allow himself to be spun. All he had to do was remember who he was dealing with. A heartless, money-grubbing businessman who would sell his own mother for the back rent alone. "Why did you destroy the site on Catherine Street?" he asked. Fairhaven bowed his head slightly. "The project was behind schedule. We were fast-tracking the excavation. It would have cost me $40,000 a day. I'm not in the archaeology business." "Some archaeologists say you destroyed one of the most important sites to be discovered in Manhattan in a quarter century." Fairhaven cocked his head. "Really? Which archaeologists?" "The Society for American Archaeology, for example." A cynical smile broke out on Fairhaven's face. "Ah, I see. Well, of course they'd be against it. If they had their way, no one in America would turn over a spadeful of soil without an archaeologist standing by with screen, trowel, and toothbrush. Getting back to the site, Mr. Smithback, what I did was perfectly legal. When we discovered those remains, I personally stopped all work. I personally examined the site. We called in forensic experts who photographed everything. We removed the remains with great care, had them examined, and then properly buried, all at my own expense. We did not restart work until we had direct authorization from the mayor. What more would you have me do?" Smithback felt a small twinge. This was not proceeding quite as expected. He was letting Fairhaven control the agenda. That was the problem. "You said you had the remains buried. Why? Was there anything perhaps you were trying to hide? At this, Fairhaven actually laughed, leaning back in his chair, exposing beautiful teeth. You made it sound suspicious. Yeah, you make it sound suspicious. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I'm a man with some small religious values. Those poor people were killed in a hideous way. I wanted to give them a decent burial with an ecumenical service. Quiet and dignified, free of the whole media circus. That's what I did. Buried them together with their little effects in a real cemetery. I didn't want their bones ending up in a museum drawer. So I purchased a beautiful tract in the Gates of Heaven Cemetery in Valhalla, New York. I'm sure the cemetery director will be happy to show you the plot. Their remains were my responsibility, and, frankly, I had to do something with them. The city certainly didn't want them. Right, said Smithback, thinking. It would make a nice sidebar, this quiet burial under the leafy elms. But then he frowned. Christ, was he getting spun here? Time for a new track. According to the records, you're a major donor to the mayor's re-election campaign. You get in a pinch at your construction site, and he bails you out. Coincidence? Fairhaven leaned back in the chair. Drop the wide-eyed babe-in-the-woods look. You know perfectly well how things work in this town. When I give money to the mayor's campaign, I am exercising my constitutional rights. I don't expect any special treatment, and I don't ask for it. But if you get it, so much the better. Fairhaven smiled broadly, cynically, but said nothing. Smithback felt another twinge of concern. This guy was being very careful about what he actually said. Trouble was, you couldn't record a cynical smile. He stood. Pardon? And walked with what he hoped looked like casual confidence toward the paintings. Hands behind his back, studying them, trying to frame a new strategy. Then he moved to the gun case. Inside, polished weapons gleamed. Interesting choice of office decor, he said, gesturing at the case. I collect the rarest of handguns. I can afford to. The one you are pointing at, for example, is a Luger, chambered in .45. The only one ever made. I also have a collection of Mercedes-Benz Roadsters, but they take up rather more display space, so I keep them at my place in Sag Harbor. Fairhaven looked at him, still smiling cynically. We all collect things, Mr. Smithback. What's your passion? Museum monographs and chapbooks, perhaps? Removed for research, then not returned? By accident, of course. Smithback looked at him sharply. Had the guy searched his apartment? But no. Fairhaven was merely fishing. He returned to the chair. Mr. Fairhaven. Fairhaven interrupted him, his tone suddenly brisk. Unfriendly. Look, Smithback, I know you're exercising your constitutional right to skewer me. The big bad real estate developer is always an easy target. And you like easy targets. Because you fellows are all cut from the same cloth. You all think your work is important. But today's newspaper is lining tomorrow's birdcage. It's ephemera. What you do, in the larger scheme of things, is nugatory. Nugatory? What the hell did that mean? It didn't matter. Clearly, it was an insult. He was getting under Fairhaven's skin. That was good, wasn't it? Mr. Fairhaven, I have reason to believe that you've been pressuring the museum to stop this investigation. I'm sorry. What investigation? The one into Enoch Lang and the 19th century killings. That investigation? Why should I care one way or another about it? I didn't stop my construction project, and frankly, that's all. It didn't stop my construction project, and frankly, that's all I care about. They can investigate it now until they're blue in the face, if they so choose. And I love this phrase all you journalists use. I have reason to believe. What you really mean is, I want to believe, but I haven't a shred of evidence. All you fellows must have taken the same Journalism 101 class, making an ass of yourself while you're pretending to get the story. Fairhaven allowed himself a cynical laugh. Smithback sat stiffly, listening to the laughter subside. Once again, he tried to tell himself he was getting under Fairhaven's skin. He spoke, at last, keeping his voice as cool as possible. Tell me, Mr. Fairhaven, just why is it that you're so interested in the museum? I happen to love the museum. It's my favorite museum in the world. I practically grew up in that place, looking at the dinosaurs, the meteorites, the gems. I had a nanny who used to take me. She necked with her boyfriend behind the elephants while I wandered around by myself. But you're not interested in that, because it doesn't fit your image of the greedy real estate developer. Really, Smithback, I'm wise to your game. Mr. Fairhaven grinned. You want a confession? This temporarily stopped Smithback. Fairhaven lowered his voice to confessional level. I have committed 2 unforgivable crimes. Smithback tried to maintain the hard-bitten, reportorial look he cultivated in instances like these. He knew this was going to be some kind of trick or a joke. My 2 crimes are these. Are you ready? Smithback checked to see if the recorder was still running. I am rich, and I am a developer. My 2 truly unforgivable sins. My culpa. Mea culpa. Against all his better journalistic instincts, Smithback found himself getting pissed off. He'd lost the interview. It was, in fact, a dead loss. The guy was a slimeball, but he was remarkably adroit at dealing with the press. So far, Smithback had nothing, and he was going to get nothing. He made one last push, anyway. You still haven't explained... Fairhaven stood. Smithback, if you only knew how utterly predictable you and your questions are. If you only knew how tiresome and mediocre you are as a reporter, and, I'm sorry to say, as a human being, you'd be mortified. I'd like an explanation, but Fairhaven was pressing a buzzer. His voice smothered the rest of Smithback's questions. Miss Gallagher, would you kindly show Mr. Smithback out? Yes, Mr. Fairhaven. This is rather abrupt. Mr. Smithback, I am tired. I saw you because I didn't want to read about myself in the paper, having refused comment. I was also curious to meet you, to see if you were perhaps a cut above the rest. Now that I've satisfied myself on that score, I don't see any reason to continue this conversation. The secretary stood in the door, stout and unmovable. Mr. Smithback, this way, please. On his way out, Smithback paused in the outermost secretary's office. Despite his efforts at self-control, his frame was quivering with indignation. Fairhaven had been parrying a hostile press for more than a decade. Naturally, he'd gotten damned good at it. Smithback had dealt with nasty interviewees before, but this one really got under his skin. Calling him tiresome, mediocre, ephemeral, nugatory. He'd have to look that up. Who did he think he was? Fairhaven himself was too slippery to pin down. No big surprise there. There were other ways to find things out about people. People in power had enemies, and enemies loved to talk. Sometimes the enemies were working for them, right under their nose. He glanced at the secretary. She was young, sweet, and looked more approachable than the battle axes manning the inner offices. Here every Saturday? He smiled nonchalantly. Most of them, she said, looking up from her computer. She was cute, with glossy red hair and a small splash of freckles. He winced, inwardly, suddenly reminded of Nora. Works you hard, doesn't he? Mr. Fairhaven? Sure does. Probably makes you work Sundays, too. Oh, no, she said. Mr. Fairhaven never works on Sunday. He goes to church. Smithback feigned surprise. Church? Is he Catholic? Presbyterian. Probably a tough man to work for, I bet. No, he's one of the best supervisors I've had. He actually seems to care about us little folk. Never would have guessed it, Smithback said with a wink, drifting out the door. Probably boning her and the other little folk on the side, he thought. Back on the street, Smithback allowed himself a most un-Presbyterian string of oaths. He was going to dig into this guy's past until he knew every detail, down to the name of his goddamn teddy bear. You couldn't become a big-time real estate developer in New York City and keep your hands clean. There would be dirt, and he would find it. Yes, there would be dirt. And by God, there would be dirt. As fun as this has been, I feel that is a fun place to stop. A nice way to get back into things. Also, I have been streaming for a considerable amount of time, a comfortable amount of time. And I hope for those of you who are watching, however many of you, maybe 2, maybe 1, that you enjoyed your time. It was fun reading for y'all, and you can expect to see me next Monday. Same time, same place. I will wish y'all a good night, and sweet dreams.